There was only one decisive game in round 4 in the Tal Memorial today, and that was between Fabiano Caruana against Hikaru Nakamura. Let's take a look and see what happened. Caruana with the white pieces, and it was a Najdorf variation. I'm always pleased to see that on the board. My favourite variation with the black pieces, this funny move. Pawn to a6, preventing a piece going to b5. Also sometimes preparing this move and preparing b5 too. So Caruana tried the English attack. Now, in the last couple of months, he's played this on several occasions. He lost against Dominguez in the FIDE Grand Prix tournament in Thessaloniki. He lost against Topalov in the Grand Prix tournament in Zug. And a couple of rounds ago, he lost against Gelfand. So, was this going to be the triumph of hope over experience? Let's see. Well, you might recall that Topalov played bishop e7 in this position. Gelfand played knight d7. Nakamura chose the move that Dominguez played against Caruana fairly recently, h5, preventing g4. Well, this is a very typical move, h5. I know it looks a bit weird, but actually, once you prevent g4, it changes the nature of the position completely. White usually has to play in a much more positional way. You can, of course, still castle queenside, for example, here, and that can be a bit sharper. But very often, white chooses to play with knight d5, somehow exploit the fact that this pawn is left out on a limb. And this was the continuation of Caruana against Dominguez, and Dominguez took on d5 and played g6. Now, in this way, black gives up the two bishops, but you don't lose any time, and you can develop very quickly indeed with bishop g7 and so on. But Nakamura played like this. He didn't want to give up his bishop pair, which is all very well, but the only problem is you lose time. So can white exploit that in some way? Now, most games in this position have just gone bishop e7, and that's reasonable for black. But Nakamura played rook c8, which I think is a good idea, actually. And the point is, okay, that was threatening c2, of course, that's defended. Very often, white plays knight a5, as we'll see, and then the rook will protect the pawn from the side. Let's see. Well, again, bishop e7 is possible here, but queen h4 check was played. Clearly, this was Nakamura's preparation. He was playing these moves quite quickly, and I was very interested to see when I checked this. This is, in fact, the computer's choice. So, well, let's see, why is he playing like this? Because it looks slightly odd to position the queen here. Well, I think the point is the queen would like to go to g6, and that kind of straightens out black's pieces. And you've got something to bite on the king side now. Later on, maybe h4 will happen, perhaps provoking g4. It's all in the timing, of course. So it's a kind of a provocative move, this check. But still, it does lose a bit of time. Okay, so castles. Now, I would like to play queen g6 here with black, but that'll just be met by bishop d3, and the exchange will give white some initiative on the c-file. So, in other words, queen g6 doesn't achieve too much. So, bishop e7 played, knight a5, and rook c7. That's the move I was talking about. Of course, if b6, then the knight comes in c6, and that is a splendid square. So that's why rook c7 is played. But I mean, this is a very familiar maneuver, and very often black has to protect the b pawn with a queen coming to c7, or sometimes more passively rook b8. But in this case, the rook manages to defend the pawn from a more active square on the c-file. So I like Nakamura's maneuver very much. Okay, so bishop d3. Well, that seems reasonable, because as soon as black castles, then it probably will be possible to play bishop d3, and I wouldn't imagine bishop d3 would be very good in that circumstance. So I think white needs to play like this. Well, both sides have I think fairly clear plans here. White has a queenside pawn majority, and if it's possible to get in the pawn break c5, of course, he'll have a strong pass d-pawn, or potentially a strong pass d-pawn. And black has a kingside pawn majority, which means it's going to be more, well, probably, yeah, it's easier for black to attack on the king side. That's probably where he's going to develop an initiative. But still, it's very early days. I mean, those are the very rough outlines of plans. Rook e8. Well, this is a good move because very often the e-file opens. So it's good to station the rook here, either with white playing f4 or sometimes black breaking with e4. So rook e8 is a very standard move in this kind of position. And white continues with his build-up on the queen side. Bishop f8, good curl up, I like that move. Just getting ready in case e4 becomes possible. Now you'll notice at the moment it's not possible for white to break with c5. There are too many black pieces controlling c5. However, I still think that that is the move that white should really be preparing for, or sort of have in mind, or give himself that option. And for that reason, I don't particularly like Caruana's next move, rook e1. It feels to me as though the rook is dragged away to the wrong side of the board. I know this kind of preempts any activity from black on the king side, but it just feels like not the right square to me. I think I prefer knight b3 in this position. Now, it's partly to do with building up c5, but actually I quite like just putting the knight back on d2 because it stops any nonsense with e4 from black. Control c4. Now I've still got the rook on c-file, so you never know, this might be a move at some point. But it just feels very solid to bring the knight back here. Helps the king. You know, I mean, I think this position is roughly equal. But yeah, I like bringing the knight back like that. Okay, so rook e1 played. And black is still sorting himself out on the king side. It might be the queen drops back. It might be that the queen goes to f5 and the bishop to g7. But g6 is kind of a tidy move. Now I think white could wait here, actually, or even come back with knight d2. But Caruana played queen d2, which, well, I don't know, I'm not that keen on, because now the queen came forward and controls some important diagonals. And that just feels like a little bit of progress for black. And also makes room for the knight to come to f6. And now c5 is possible. And then it's going to get really sharp. I mean, one possible line is to play h4 in this position. And if g4, we could actually get a forced draw here. For example, takes now here, and if the king goes back to g1, it's a draw by perpetual check. And if queen g2, well, we start taking pawns on the other side of the board. That's 4 pawns for a piece. Must be good enough. But yeah, it's quite possible a draw would result after c5. You could also take this, and this is very typical. So this advances. Now this looks fantastic, but actually black can break up these pawns, and we've got a really sharp position where, well, this is a strong pawn, but it's under control at the moment. b8 is under control, and there could well be counterattacking chances against the king, but yeah, I wouldn't rush into that if I were black. So c5 would be very, very messy here, very unclear position, but I feel that black should have sufficient counterplay on the king side. Bishop b6 played. And if knight b7 here, you can just play rook c4, so everything's all right. F4 played. I don't like that move. It feels as though these squares are just much weaker now. It's even possible just to take on f4, and after all these exchanges, well, black is certainly not worse in this endgame. You can see that black's rook is really active, so's the bishop. Looks good on h6. The knight, well, does a good job protecting b6 and preempt, and also controls c5. I mean, white's pieces are also okay. Just a very unclear endgame. But that is possible for black to play like that. But Nakamura played e4, and I think that's reasonable to keep the queens on here, considering that white's king doesn't have too many minor pieces around it. You can see these are a long way from the action. And the rook came back. And if bishop b6, well, here the rook could switch over to d7, and in that way black would continue. Okay, h3 played here. That weakens white's king side. Don't like that move. Obviously it can't be taken at the moment because of bishop takes f6. But after this, now this is threatened. Queen g2 played. If bishop b6 is interesting to see what happens, and this is very typical, you can see there's all this energy behind the pawn on e4, so black can give it up in this position. And if rook takes, queen takes, and this is just a tremendous position, then black will be able to use e file and these squares. The queen's looking great as well. There are some other moves too, for example here, and if bishop takes, then knight g4 threatens the queen, and queen h2 mate. Okay, queen g2 played, and b5 is a great move, just undermining the support for the d5 pawn. And now I think in practical terms white is probably lost. I mean, if pawn takes, then just knight takes d5. And once again we have in the Najdorf black's central pawn majority about to roll down the board. Caruana tried bishop takes f6, but this really didn't help that much because now the dark squares are absolutely creaking and the king is in big trouble. That's a nice square for the knight, but it's actually completely irrelevant. G5 was played here. Let's have a look at pawn takes pawn. Then comes, there's a very nice finish actually, rook a8. Threat, queen h4 and rook h2. So queen h3 and now queen b2. And if king h1, f5 is beautiful and the rook comes down. So in the game, g5 was played, but it doesn't really help. Does this look dangerous? Well, not really, because basically black gets to the king a long time before the d-pawn becomes at all dangerous. And in this position, actually, Caruana resigned because there's no decent defense to rook h8. And remember, the king cannot step backwards because of the bishop. So once again, a really convincing victory for the Najdorf, and we see it so many times that it's very often white's king that becomes exposed and weak on the king side once these pawns advance. So after 4 rounds, Nakamura is leading the tournament with 3 out of 4. 2 players in second position on 2.5. Mamedyarov and Gelfand. All the other games were drawn today. Thanks for watching.